Hello, this is Angela with Parker's Permaculture. I had not intended to make a video today. I'm actually outside splitting wood, but there's this exchange I had online with one of my neighbors this morning that keeps running through my head. And so while I'm a little tired and winded and I'm taking a break, I thought I would take a few moments and dive into some of the research that has come out lately about ultra-processed food and some of the pushback against that, or some of the conversations that are being had in all kinds of spaces that are relevant to permaculture spaces, in spaces where folks are growing their own food, in spaces where folks are interested in sustainable community, where folks are interested in food justice. So I will link down below to the original study and some articles that discuss it. I always think it's important to go and read the actual study because newspaper articles can kind of distill it down to something that may not be super accurate and may not be super reflective of what the data shows, but it makes for a catchy headline. So this study came out last week, I think, that said there is a comprehensive link between elevated risk for certain cancers and your consumption of ultra-processed foods. Now, I will also link below, lots of links in this video. I will link below to how the USDA and how in America we designate the level of processing of foods, right? Because it is a scale. So ultra processed is at the end. And some of those foods used to actually be called food products and not be allowed to be called food at all. There is a lot that happens in the processing of food, and food can be minimally processed. Things like, if I'm eating applesauce, that is processed. Those are processed apples. If I am, putting matcha powder into my smoothie, that is a processed food. So we're not always talking about things like hot dogs and sugar cereal and, soft drinks. But the study that came out showed that those really ultra-processed foods, the larger a proportion of your diet that is made up of those foods, the higher risk of certain cancers, and particularly your risk of ovarian cancer, which is obviously really relevant to me. You can check out my video on being a pre-vivor here. And there has been quite a bit of pushback against that coverage of that study. So I've noticed that some of the responses to this study, and particularly to the news coverage of it, have been polar opposites. There's the crowd that's like, of course, yes, ultra-processed foods are terrible for you and impact your health and have real ramifications for you, and that we are not evolved to eat highly processed foods for, 41% of our diet, which I think is the amount that was quoted as the highest risk in the study. And especially in kind of groups that lean more toward organic and intentional eating, there can be a bit of shaming, not a bit, a lot of shaming of people who eat highly processed foods, a lot of highly processed foods. And it can almost develop into sort of not only kind of a self-righteous judgmentalism, like I am better and more pure and healthier because I eat cleaner foods. It can really branch into two different problematic areas. One being orthorexia, where it becomes disordered eating around clean, good foods, whole foods. And then the other being the blaming of people who eat a diet that is different than yours for their health problems, saying that if folks had only eaten better, they wouldn't have arthritis, or they wouldn't have cancer, or they wouldn't have, XYZ health problem. And so it can become very victim blamey. And that's a whole host of problems. I think I've talked a little bit about it in other videos. That's a whole host of problems that we want to make sure that we don't embrace, and we don't step into that kind of faulty thinking in permaculture. Those of us that are interested in permaculture design tend to have an inherent interest in growing our own food, in having a high nutrient value. We're feeding our soil, we're remineralizing our soil so that the food that we grow has the optimal amount of nutrition. And that can make us prone to some of these clean eating fallacies. You are not a better or more morally pure person because you have a clean diet, or you eat all local and organic and seasonal and less refined food. Folks who eat more highly processed food are not somehow inferior and are not somehow to blame for their own illness or lack of health. However, there are clear studies that show that the composition of your diet, like the study that just came out, can have an impact on your health. Now, at the same time, I've seen this kind of, like smug, of course, what you eat impacts your health and your risk of cancer. And of course, if you eat these foods that we've not evolved to eat, your risk of cancer is going to be higher. The flip side of that has been this pushback of saying fed is best, which is a phrase that is taken from the very heated, impassioned exchange between breastfeeding advocates and, formula feeding. That has its own host of problems when you say fed is best. And the other phrase that I have heard quite a bit since this article came out is all food is clean food. All food is real food. Because of the comments of there's clean food versus dirty food, there's real food versus fake food. And I understand those sentiments. I understand wanting to say, whatever food you have access to, that is food that you can feed yourself with, and you shouldn't be exposed to judgment for that. I understand wanting to say, all food is real food. And I understand wanting to destigmatize highly processed foods, which tend to be much more affordable and much more accessible to a whole host of people, including people with disabilities, non-neurotypical people, people who are working and don't have time to source everything in their own garden or don't even have a garden or cook everything from scratch. People who are in poverty and people who live in food deserts who have very limited access to other kinds of food. We need to remove the judgment against them for eating highly processed foods. But at the same time, not all food is equal. And so what I've seen in these groups, mostly from kind of middle class, upper middle class, affluent white moms in my demographic, middle class white moms in their 40s, has been this: you can't criticize the kinds of foods that are available in American society, or as in the study, British society. And I think that's deeply flawed. We want to make sure that we are never criticizing people who are forced to operate in a broken, corrupt, exploitive, damaging system. But at the same time, we don't gaslight those people by saying that because we aren't criticizing them, they and us cannot criticize the system itself. We want to make sure that we are focusing our criticism against the system and injustices and inequalities and problems in the system, and not the people who have to live in that system and operate in it. So yes, people who need to eat more highly processed foods for whatever reason may have some negative health outcomes. That's not their fault. Criticism shouldn't be lobbed at them. Judgment shouldn't be lobbed at them. But at the same time, don't tell somebody who is stuck in poverty, someone who lives in a food desert, someone who doesn't have appropriate access to highly nutritious, nutrient-dense, nourishing foods, that they should treat all food as equal and that it's just fed is best, and they shouldn't have concerns about the kind of food that they're eating. I think we really are in danger of gaslighting folks and telling them that you should just be content with your food access and your food situation, because really all food is real food. Except nutritionally, we know that that is not true. And we know there are consequences to eating foods highly laden with herbicides and pesticides. We know there are health consequences for eating extremely highly processed foods and food products in a disproportionate amount in your diet. You want to make sure that you have grace for yourself. I mean, I love jelly beans, especially the pear flavor and the buttered popcorn flavor. I eat my share of highly processed foods. But I also know that I'm conscious of balance in my diet, and that I have the privilege and the ability to afford balance in my diet, and not everybody does. So I want to reserve judgment against myself if I eat highly processed foods. I want to have grace for myself, and I definitely want to reserve judgment against other people. But at the same time, I'm going to lob all the frickin' judgment in the world against the system. That means that a significant portion of our population, it tends to be mothers of young children, people of color, people in urban areas, have a lack of access to the foods that their bodies have evolved to eat and are deeply nourishing and are lacking in those contaminants that ultra-processed foods often have, or conventional foods often have. You have every right, if you are in a position where you don't have access to the food that you deserve to eat, and I personally believe that access to nourishing whole foods is a human right. You have every right to be frustrated and to speak out and to say this is a problem and not all food is equal. At the same time, we have to be really careful how we balance that so that we are critiquing the system and not the people in it. And that when we are telling people who are trapped in the system, it's okay to eat those foods and you should not be judged, we are not also silencing their own concern about their diets and their lack of food access. So I think it's a really tricky line to walk. I feel like there is that tendency for us to want to judge individuals, and we have to check ourselves and say why is it that we want to judge individuals and we want to give them a hard time when the problems are these systemic issues. And it's not our business what other people eat. It is our business what inequalities and what exploitation and what problems exist in the system that we are all a part of. Those are two really different things. So I don't know if you have thoughts about that. I think for those of us who are interested in sustainable living and are interested in permaculture and growing our own food and really intentional about our eating choices and have the privilege to be intentional about our eating choices, that studies like this are really relevant to our lives. But also, as people who are invested in people care, as permaculture folks who want to create a more just and equitable society, we should be just as concerned about food deserts, about food injustice, about lack of access to the foods that we enjoy and other people should have access to as well. So let's reserve the judgment from individuals and let's work to make the system better. Thanks for watching today. I'm going to get back to splitting wood. I feel like my arms are rested. I'll be back with my regular video later this week.